Okay, so I wanted to start with this slide because I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of newspaper articles or the information that has come on Keezhadi so far, where there has been articles that talk about how Keezhadi has increased in the intake of archaeology students at the University of Madras, the dating from the samples from Keezhadi site, as well as the fact that they're going to be continuing the excavation. So that brings us to the question of, I thought, let's start with the question of where is Keezhadi. This is an archaeological site which is about half an hour away from Madurai, and the archaeologists who have worked here state that it's about 110 acres in area. The archaeological site is, that is the size of the site here. And to give you like a brief overview of what has happened so far, in 2013-14, the ASI conducted what is called village-to-village survey. So they basically go from village to village, identifying archaeological sites, sometimes those that have already been reported, and doing this from 400 sites in Dindukal, Madurai, Ramanathapuram, Sivagangai, and Theni districts. They located 293 sites along the Vaigai River. And then the next year, subsequently, in 2014-15, they excavated 42 trenches, and each of these were about 10 meters square. And then the next year, 58. And then at this point is when the articles which I showed you first came out, where they spoke about the resemblance between Harappan sites and basically definitely highlighting the like in this, but also talking about the two. And at this time, the superintendent of the person who was one of the lead investigators here from ASI, he was transferred, and there was a lot of newspaper articles that spoke about that, but I won't really go into that here. And then the subsequent year, though he wasn't there, the ASI continued excavation. They excavated 10 trenches. I haven't seen any reports on this year's that particular year's excavation, but this was from somebody who worked on the site. I got this information. And then the next year, the Department of Archaeology from Tamil Nadu, they took over the excavation. They excavated 11 trenches. And then the next year, I don't actually have information for how many trenches, and then they have continued this year. And then I also wanted to point out that in 2018, there was a peer-reviewed article from the journal called Heritage from Kerala, which had an article from Ramakrishna, who is the Amarnath Ramakrishna, who is a lead investigator, along with his collaborators. He published an article on the ASI's first few years of excavation. And then Tamil Nadu State Department of Archaeology also published a multilingual book in many languages. They published a report on their excavation years. So looking at these two excavation reports, what do we understand? We see that they have both chosen to do similar kinds of excavation. So they've both done grid excavation, where they have basically dug out squares, which was the 10-meter square area, the size that I was talking about. And the idea about these excavations is that it gives you more control, because you have 4 different sites from which you can collect measurements for the location of the artifacts and the structures within the trench. And then if you find structures such as these, you can at the correct time, you can remove the block or the wall that separates these different trenches. So it's good for large scale horizontal excavations. And so here you can see that they've removed those walls, and this is like this reveals the whole structure and helps you understand it better. Whereas the Tamil Nadu State Department of Archaeology did something similar, except they left out a lot of areas in between. And it's not really clear why. I can only speculate that it was to do with the structures and where they were found. And so so that has been their thing, where they have excavated in specific places. And this is as much as I can kind of figure out in terms of the methods that they both used. In terms of what do we know from it, it seems that the excavations reveal that the prime occupation was agriculture, according to the Tamil Nadu report, the State Department report, as well as there was iron industry, carpentry, pottery making, weaving, etc. But the report also talks about how 53% of the animal bone remains from this site were from ox, cow, buffalo, and goat. And this they see as a way of understanding the agriculture supporting their argument of agriculture as a prime occupation. Though one would think that this is a better argument for pastoralism. Again, I should highlight that I'm not in any way suggesting that the two should not coexist and should be could well have coexisted with each other. But their report also says pottery was largely sourced from local clay, meaning they were produced locally, and that there was no object of worship amongst the terracotta figurines that they found, though it's unclear exactly why they say that or what they were looking for in terms of an object of worship. They did find a number of glass beads, semi-precious stones. There has been a lot of conversation on the structures being industrial in nature, and therefore this being a site has been referred to by the reports also as an industrial site, because they found these square things which they identified as where textiles were dyed, as well as spindle whorls were found there. There were also iron artifacts and gold artifacts found here. So I just want to go back a little bit to the aim that they talk about. So the aim of the excavation that they express is to identify urban settlements and correlate this with the Sangam literature. And if you were here for yesterday's lecture, Dr. Sarvakumar spoke a lot about it. So I won't go into that, but I just want to highlight that aspect of it. And then the fact that the newspaper reports again talk a lot about the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and constant comparisons with that. So if you think about why did then Keezhadi become so important, or what is it that draws so much of attention in Keezhadi? I mean, in my mind, I can think of Sangam literature as the aim that ASI themselves have stated, the Harappan-like comparisons that have been made, and then the obvious constantly existing Aryan-Dravidian question. So in terms of all three, one of the commonalities that I see in this is this need for identifying the urban or seeing this site as urban and seeing that as somehow helping each of these arguments further. So going back to the question of urban, I wanted to look a little bit at the history of where this idea of the urban comes from and how do we understand that. And I mean, a simplistic way of looking at it would be to say that urban signifies development and therefore signifies civilized or civilization. And this is coming from the kind of colonial context of some of the theories and ideas established at that point. So you see that in the 19th century, Taylor and Morgan come up with this idea of the linear cultural evolution, which uses archaeological and anthropological data to look at the history of people as stages of evolution over time. So you see them as describing band or bandit, and this is connected to, say, from a prehistoric context, which then evolves into a tribe, and then a chiefdom, and then the state as being the most evolved form of it. And I'll come back to the state in a second. But there was also a reaction against this, and one of the reactions against it was that it doesn't have to have happened within the geographies in which they were, but that there could be outside influence, such as migration, diffusion, and all sorts of like interactions that could have led to this. And then this leads to a cultural historic kind of framework where chronology and spatial ordering of the culture become really important in how we understand the past. So I won't go too much into detail in all of this because I have lots more to say, but in a sense, a lot of this idea of the state and the formation of the state and its connection to the urban also has a past in which different aspects were seen as important in understanding this. For example, irrigation or water management was seen as important. And in this, you see river valley civilization as also becoming something that gets highlighted. And then there's warfare, internal conflict. And then you have the idea of population growth. But essentially, this all moves to a point in the 1970s where you see them being much more interrelated, seen as being much more interrelated to each other, and having a more connected relationship where, for example, in this case study from coastal Peru, the idea was that population growth and agricultural resources and control of those, or fighting over them, led to more warfare between different settlements, and this led to the creation of hierarchies or social dominance, which led to getting tributes from the less dominant ones, and that is connected to administrative needs, centralized organization, military organization, and all of that, and that these are connected to each other. But then we can also, see later on, like in 1972, Colin Renshaw talks about the different, and I'm actually, I have to say, I'm really sorry for this image. I did try to make it look nice, but it ended up looking more like a Frankenstein kind of like image. But the point that I wanted to make with it is that you have these subsystems that come together and are in very related to each other, and it isn't like one leads to the other, but they're different subsystems that are connected to each other. And in a sense, this leads to brings me back to the question of the urban. So I refer here to a paper by Cowgill from 2004, where he talks about permanent settlement within the larger territory, and this is how he sees the urban, is a permanent settlement within the larger territory occupied by society, considered home by significant numbers of residents, whose activities, roles, practices, experiences, and identities and attitudes differ significantly from those of other members of the society who identify more closely with the rural lands outside the settlement. So in a sense, he also later talks about how do we understand size of settlements? Is a bigger settlement therefore an urban? Can a state society have no urban, or can there be urban without that? And as well as the difference between the urban and the non-urban as significant for understanding the urban in itself. And so taking this forward, I thought I'd go back to a paper by Adam Green and Cameron Petrie from 2018, where they've highlighted the need for archaeological survey in order to understand these dynamics of social complexity, as well as the fact that the scale of these surveys should be much larger than we have at present. And they also use existing or previous archaeological survey data and bring it together to better understand these areas that they're talking about. And one of the things that they conclude with the work that they have done is that settlement densities can help you understand urbanization as well as deurbanization by looking at these aspects. Again, I won't go too much into this, but I just wanted to highlight that there's a paper by Vishnupriya Basak where she talks about the urban being different in terms of North India or the Gangetic Plain in the south in how we imagine or how we understand it. And I have to go back to Cowgill's paper here because he also highlights the need for us to recognize that there is no one urban or the urban that we imagine, but there are many urbans, and we need to kind of think about it as different forms in order to be able to identify it. And the rough kind of the broad ways in which we understand it could be heterogeneity, hierarchy, craft specialization. And here she talks about much more detailed aspects. And here this is based on Gordon Child's understanding of urban, which has been something that has continued to be used over the decades. And again, I think the thing to highlight here is that it doesn't mean that this becomes what we use all over South Asia to understand the urban, that there can be different ways in which we imagine it. But one of the things she highlights as being lacking, which again is takes me back to Cowgill, is the idea that we don't have very clear understandings of settlement hierarchy or the distinctions between the urban and the non-urban, which was one of the things that he talks about in terms of understanding the urban. And then I think I'll come back to Keezhadi for this because I wanted to think a little bit about the report and how it identified Keezhadi and all the different aspects that have been added to this image we have of Keezhadi as being a place with large brick structures, agriculture being the prime occupation, different craft industries. So if we go back to Vishnupriya's definition of the urban, this in a sense tries to fit into that understanding of the urban in some ways. But I wanted to look back at this picture, which is from that newspaper article, where the thing I'm missing from the reports, and I really wish I knew more about Keezhadi, having not been in that site, is the different phases of construction, different phases of occupation, different phases of activities that have happened here. Because in this image, you can see that there are different brick structures which kind of weave into and out of each other, and it's unclear whether this is different phases of activities, was it one phase, and those would be really interesting if we wanted to understand the site better. And just to kind of, I think, highlight this, I wanted to take you to the car park of NIAS. And this is the car park where you can see, I don't know if you can see, but there's a brick structure here, which may be clearer here. And this is something I think people generally don't notice if you have ever visited NIAS, or if you haven't, you often don't notice some of these things which seem kind of obvious, but are actually remnants. So this is actually a remnant of activity that happened 20 years ago, where temporary housing for construction workers had been built for NIAS. And this is not something you would normally notice, but it's almost like we live along with these different phases of activities in terms of just understanding how these sites are formed or how different phases are formed. So this leaves us with questions of what happens in these empty spaces like this car park, where there are actually activities that we could imagine that nothing has happened, but also how we define what is a site and what is outside it and what information we can get, and making survey really important hence. Also to bring back the question of what do these excavations tell us which is new. If you were again here for yesterday's lecture by Dr. Selvakumar, which I'm really thankful that he set this up, is that he spoke about the various different archaeological sites in Tamil Nadu which show you similar kinds of excavations that have been results that have been got from excavations. And then the other question that I wanted to ask was, does the number of sites tell you more about the site? So if it's 50 or 5, does it make a big difference in terms of how we understand the site or the information we get from it? And so I just wanted to do a rough calculation. So this is the view from the, not the aerial view of the aerial view previous slide. And so you can see why it's much more complex than just thinking of it as different phases of activity, but also in terms of thinking of the speed at which the excavation is happening, whether the number of trenches make a difference. On a rough calculation here, I figure that it'll take about 44 years for them, based on whatever they have said, to excavate the whole site. So it would seem like that's a long time. And in some ways, I'm really thankful it's 44 years, because there could be many different technologies that come up which would help us understand this better. But at the same time, it would seem like, therefore, it needs to be clearer as to where and what is being excavated in the site. And then the question is also the clarity of the data that is being got from these excavations. So you can see here that this is the structure from Udayur, and this is why the structure of Keezhadi was identified as dying that, because they looked so similar and they reminded everybody of each other. But then when I compared the sizes of the structures, what I found was that there was not enough information to begin with. There was a lot of missing information, but also that it needs much more analysis than just the seeming external similarity of it. And that brings me, that makes me wonder whether the speed at which these excavations happen, of like 50, 48 or more trenches every year, is there a lack of control of the data we're getting from the excavation because of it? Is there something we're missing in terms of documentation because of it? And then in terms of the rural and the urban, or looking at it together, I also wonder whether the imagination of how we think of Keezhadi, as in this picture, in this article, it's clearly that there's a similarity here that's being drawn to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, at least in the imagination, and that's the kind of urban that is being looked for or sought after. Whereas I do wonder whether the kind of habitations we're looking for is more like these two images here and very different from how we're imagining it. And therefore, is it something that's being missed in what we're looking in the excavations that we're conducting or seeing? And then this brings me to the current excavations that's happening. This year, the Tamil Nadu Archaeology Department has decided to do excavations in 5 different sites. And I don't know, you may have seen a lot of newspaper articles and reports on it. They've been doing lots of excavations in these 5 sites. And they include megalithic or Iron Age early historic burial site, and continue to work in habitation sites as well. And yet I feel that there are a lot of unresolved issues that would help us understand why and where we're excavating and how we're excavating. And that would be useful in terms of the information we get back from the excavations as well. And these are some of the questions that I kind of like came up with to think in terms of whether it would be useful to move more in direction of looking at these questions in the terminology that we're using and how we're understanding it, whether it is the Iron Age or urbanization, whether it's obscuring things more. Do we need to understand it better or try and identify or define it better, or is it just not? Is it just hindering us rather than helping us? And also the idea of the urban as being static or not changing over time, and therefore we're not looking at the different phases of occupation or different things that are happening in a site and the changes that are happening, that it would remain the same, and not looking at the medieval or later periods, because it would be an important way to understand these changes at one particular site over time, as well as a relationship between what is happening, what we're seeing as, or what we're imagining as the urban, and everything else around it. And maybe that would help us understand the urban a little better, and also to move away, because I think we unconsciously have kept or remained with these simple ideas of like urban helps us think of something as civilized, and the non-urban is somehow not so civilized or primitive, and that we need to move away from these hypotheses, these ways of looking at things. So these are some of the articles that I've referred to here. And I have just one more slide remaining, and that is to thank Mira and Carol for both being really, really patient with me. And this picture is for Mira. It's a megalithic site where I've been working since 2006. And this is Carol, Kathy Morrison, who is there visiting with me at the site. So I just wanted to end with this as maybe another talk for another day. Thank you.
Thanks, Smriti, for that wonderful talk. Carol, would you like to start?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I would like to thank the organizers, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this series. As you would have heard, I'm not a person who works on history or archaeology, and I'm a social anthropologist, sociologist with an interest in urban issues. Smriti and I have been having some off and on conversations at NIAS about this whole question of what is the urban. And so she brought me in to participate in this session because we found that there's quite a lot of parallels across our disciplines in what's been the kind of debates that have been happening recently around questions of the urban. So just to begin and to maybe echo some of the things that Smriti was saying is that we often think about cities in terms of their spatial or physical or characteristics or socioeconomic characteristics or in terms of built environment. And so everyone has a particular image in their head of what is the urban or what is a city, whether we're talking about contemporary cities or cities of the past. And it's also the case that in archaeology and history, urbanization has often been equated with the notion of civilization, that the rise of large civilizations in the pre-modern era is accompanied by urbanization, and as well as the emergence of centralized states, complex societies, high literary cultures, and so on. But speaking from the point of view of sociology, in the post-industrialization period in Europe, our notion of the city actually shifted somewhat, and it became, urbanization came to be linked with the rise of industrial capitalism. And more recently, there's a lot of discussion about planetary urbanization. Everybody would be aware that the world is now supposedly more than 50% urbanized, and so this seems to be the trend of the future. So most of these theories, whether it's of modernization, economic development, or globalization, hinge on a linear progression from an agrarian to an industrial or post-industrial economy, from a rural to an urban society, as well as the progressive incorporation of cities across the world into the global economy at different scales and with different functions. But here I want to jump off from a debate that's been happening over the last 10 years or so within urban studies. And I should just mention for the audience that urban studies is a separate field of research in itself, which is multidisciplinary in nature. It draws on sociology, geography, history, economics, many different disciplines, but obviously focusing on the urban. So it is a field of study that emerged mainly in the West, people working on cities of Europe and North America in the modern era. And there has been increasing unease among scholars from the Global South and who work on cities of the Global South about the kinds of theories of the urban, or the conceptual frameworks that have been used in urban studies for a long period of time. And there's several arguments that make up this critique. One of them is to point out that a lot of the frames of analysis that are used to understand cities really don't apply very well to cities in the Global South, which are mainly post-colonial cities, cities that either had their origins under colonialism or were profoundly reshaped by colonial rule, as well as by trajectories of development in the post-colonial period. And of course, it's also been argued that we really can't understand urbanization as a homogeneous process that works the same way across all space and time. Instead, we really have to attend to the ways in which cities and towns have been marked by their particular regional histories and locations. And one aspect of this that people have been emphasizing is the fact that most cities, in fact, are very much shaped by their agrarian connections or their rural connections, especially in post-colonial context, where cities often emerge out of or in relation to the countryside, the surrounding so-called, the rural areas around them, from which they have, of course, many complex relations. So extending that idea, there's an emerging body of work on the peri-urban, particularly in South Asia, looking across various cities like Delhi, Kolkata, Bangalore, which are trying to really rethink the notion or understand what is urbanization when it's taking place in contexts that are, have very deep and very complex agrarian histories that are structured in particular ways. That is, think of the Indian village, and the many villages that surround a city like Bangalore, which I'm going to be speaking about. So the kind of, when we think about an agrarian to urban transition, it's obviously very complex, it's highly uneven, it's non-linear. You cannot just draw the same kinds of conclusions across these different places, but you really have to look very closely at a whole range of changes that are happening in these areas, in rural areas, as they get urbanized, whether it's social, economic, spatial, and so on. And so, sorry, I should have shown this slide first. And so there's a major debate happening, as I said, within urban studies, where we're trying to rethink the urban in relation to the rural, in relation to the agrarian, and think about cities. How do we understand urbanization if we think of cities as expanding and encompassing the agrarian spaces and life worlds that surround them? And one of the ways in which that's happening is to bring urban and agrarian studies into conversation with each other around the question of land. And I'm going to move to that now because land is the center of a lot of the work that we have been doing in my urban studies program at NIAS. The main point here is that land has been very central to agrarian studies for a long time because land is obviously central to agriculture. And yet the insights that we have from agrarian studies in India and other parts of South Asia have not really been taken on board in studies of cities. So I'm going to be drawing on some research that we've been doing in peri-urban sites of Bangalore under a project that's called Speculative Urbanism. We have been working on the southeastern fringe of the city and where we have been, it's a particular site. I don't want to name the specific site for reasons of research ethics, but it's an area that has seen a lot of very spectacular development over the last few years. And this just shows one of the construction sites. All of you from Bangalore would be familiar with these sites where more and more the city is pushing outwards from its current boundaries because land is at a premium. And so real estate companies that want to make large projects and they need 50 or 100 acres to do their projects really look outside the city or push the boundary of the city outwards to do these projects. So we chose a site where there was one very large project of this type under construction, which has something like 3,500 apartments. And this project was built on 100 acres of land that was purchased from around 100 households in one particular village in this area. And so we started our work by really trying to understand how the land was assembled for this project, which meant that we're really dealing with, many small land negotiations and sales by small farmers, medium farmers, and other kinds of landlords. And we were tracing the whole process to which the land was, these deals were done, the role of the land aggregator, and who then makes the deal with the developer. That was our main interest in taking up this research. But while we were doing our field work, we found that the agrarian transition is happening in many more ways than just assembling land for a large real estate project like this, which is probably the most visible. And as all of you would know, if you ever travel through any peri-urban area, whether it's Bangalore, Chennai, or anywhere, the landscape is really very chaotic, very illegible. You find in the same, small area, you'll find, agricultural fields, you'll find small apartment blocks, you'll find camps of migrant workers made out of plastic sheets. You'll find, big projects like this under construction. And so, we began to try to understand that what is this urban transition that's happening? How is it happening? Why do we find this, kind of what, apparently kind of illegible kind of a landscape before us? Often people think about this in terms of planning, that they say, oh, the cities are unplanned, there hasn't been proper planning here, that's why it looks like this. But that's a notion that I would like to actually challenge, if maybe during the discussion period. So for this particular project, we, as I said, we were looking at the ways in which land, basically agricultural land, gets transformed into real estate. What are the various pathways through which this happens? And while we were looking at this and basically doing very long-term intensive field work in a couple of villages there, we became very aware of the entanglements between land markets, political power, and caste. And I'm going to explain just a couple of elements of that to illustrate what I'm trying to argue about the ways in which the urban is built upon a pre-existing agrarian formation or structure. So these are just a few photographs of, from different angles of this project, the project coming up, the fancy gateway. But alongside this massive, kind of high-end apartment complex where you'll find, middle-class families, software engineers, and people like that living, you find these smaller apartment blocks, which are probably renting out either to students in nearby colleges or to lower middle-class families. So these kinds of buildings are being put up mostly by local people, farmers, who are now no longer able to do agriculture. now become landlords, and they put up these small units, these buildings, in order to create rental units and to make an income. And this is the thing I want to focus on the most, is the idea of the layout. Now, many of you would also be aware of this notion of the layout, the residential layout, where basically somebody gets a hold of a piece of agricultural land, could be 1 acre, 10 acres, whatever, and creates plots, which are then sold mostly to middle-class investors from the city. These are simply empty pieces of land with bare minimum of infrastructure, maybe some roads inside, maybe electricity connection. Very often people buy these as investment because the value of land is thought to always go up, rather than necessarily as planning to build a house on that. So this is one of the main modalities of the agrarian land transition that you can see in peri-urban areas, where agriculture is no longer viable, or where land is becoming increasingly valuable and people are willing to sell. This is really one of the main ways in which this transition is taking place. So we did our research basically in 2 villages. One of them was inside the BBMP boundary, and once it had become incorporated into the BBMP, and that is into the municipal limits, it was immediately zoned as yellow. That is to say, the land is already cleared for non-agricultural uses. The second village was just outside the boundary, which you can see here, in the so-called green zone. And the green zone around Bangalore is meant to be an area which is not for development except for certain specified purposes and with government permission. And it's in the green zone that, as you can well imagine, you see a lot of these layouts being made, because in the yellow zone, you can actually legally buy land and put up an apartment complex or whatever. But here in the green zone, you can't do that. So the green zone becomes a space where a lot of illegal or unauthorized or illicit activities take place, particularly the creation of these unauthorized layouts. Many of the layouts you see there have been made without the proper permissions or land conversion process, etc. Another way in which a conversion is allowed in the land conversion is allowed in the green belt is for educational institutions. So many of you would know that this is where you find all the so-called international schools and new colleges in a place like Bangalore. Why are they all on the outskirts of the city? Because it's in the green zone, and this is one of the permitted uses. This is a map of the number of institutions, educational institutions, which are there in this area where we worked. Now, I want to just give you a quick glance of, many of you would be familiar with this also, but visually, the speed at which Bangalore has really expanded over the last 20 years. I'm just going to flip the maps, and you can see the red area is the built-up area. The rest of it is, green fields or barren land or water. 2005, 2010. You see how the city is growing outwards into the rural periphery. 2015, and this is really a remarkable thing just in 2 years. This is the most recent map we have. Not only the city is becoming denser in terms of built-up areas, it's expanding in all directions. Yeah, and this is just a view of the last time the municipal limits were expanded. What's been happening is basically periodically the city expands the municipal boundary to encompass surrounding villages. And then once that happens and inside it becomes then permissible for development, the city starts to grow in that direction. So the last time that boundary expansion happened was in 2007, when 110 more villages were incorporated into the city. So this just shows the city in 2009 and the boundary, where if you now look at the map, you'll probably find most of that area in red. So going back to the question of layouts, trying to see how I'm doing for time. I just want to mention here also that, the idea, this kind of an agrarian transition by converting agricultural land into residential layouts is of course not new. Many of you would know that across the city, there are these areas of Bangalore called the revenue layout. And a revenue layout is nothing but a housing layout that's been made on agricultural land, that is land which comes under the revenue department. So what's been happening is that, these layouts get formed often without proper authorization, but over time they get legalized through various kinds of mechanisms. They get authorized. So, and because that's been happening, and because there have been various regularization schemes floated by the government over time, people are willing to buy these plots of land because they figure that even if, you know, it's not today fully legal, it will be eventually. So these are what some of these sites look like. Basically, what you do is you stop cultivation and you just create these house sites, which very often remain vacant for many, many years. They are simply sites of investment. These are pictures from our field site. Okay, so the other part of this that you know turned out to be very interesting in terms of understanding this this land transition is that we very quickly came to understand that it's closely entangled with caste conflict and caste rivalry. So a couple of our key informants in these villages were local Dalit youth who are working as real estate brokers. That is, they help with land deals, but they're also Dalit activists. And this was an equation that we found across the board, that all of the Dalit activists also worked as brokers. That is, they were very much involved in the land market, but as Dalit activists, they were very much involved in opposing what they called illegal land grabbing. And according to them, the land grabbers all belong to the dominant community. The dominant caste in these villages are Reddys. So they would always talk about how Reddys were grabbing land. They were grabbing common lands, Gomala land. They were buying up assigned lands of Dalits illegally. And they were amassing lands, amassing wealth, and then creating these kind of layouts. And so the Dalits in the village over the last few years have become very active in documenting and bringing such land grabbing cases to the attention of the authorities. And so we talked to people, of course, on both sides. And Reddys, on the other hand, of course, because they were the main landowning community, and of course wealthier than other communities, were the ones who were benefiting the most from the land market. Many of them had become real estate agents or land brokers. They had benefited from the new land market that had emerged here. And they also had political linkages, which helped them to engage in these kinds of, you know, what's been called land grabbing activities. So what we found then is, you can say, is that, you know, a kind of a crystallization of caste identity as well as caste conflict, because of the whole process of urbanization that's happening in these villages. So of course you begin with an agrarian structure where Reddys were the main landowners, Dalits were primarily agricultural workers, but also had some small lands. But now in the context of urbanization, where the land becomes much more valuable and land is becoming commoditized and assetized, the caste identity and the caste relation remains, but it gets reconfigured in a particular way. And we find a lot of assertion by Dalits who are no longer willing to kind of sit quietly while they see the land being taken over by others. Other people are making more money out of this situation and so on. And so they get organized. And the way in which they do that is by becoming members of Bangalore-based Dalit associations, or Karnataka-based, of which there are, you would be aware, quite a few. And so they use Dalit associations as, or Dalit organizations as a kind of political basis from which to fight these very localized struggles around land in these villages. What was interesting to us here is the fact that there's a kind of a double movement here happening, where Dalit brokers are also interested in making money from the land market, just as the Reddy landlords are. But they're also organizing themselves to contest what they see as the monopolization of economic power by the Reddys' monopolization of the land market. And they do so by approaching the state, and approaching the state on the platform of Dalit rights and Dalit you know, oppression. I could say a lot more about that, but I just want to move on. How am I doing for time?
Yeah, Carol, could you wrap up in about 5 minutes, maybe?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay.
So one could then say that, so what I'm saying is that in this context of a rapidly changing agrarian context, urbanization, with the, you know, the livening up of the land market, we see the sharpening of inequality and conflicts between Dalit and, in this case, Reddys, and the formation of wider political and caste alliances in both cases, which is then, you know, kind of crystallizing this conflict. One could then simply say that this is a matter of kind of instrumental identity politics, that when there's a conflict around land, people then, use whatever identities they can to kind of, push forward their own fight. But if you dig a little bit deeper, my argument here would be that actually the way in which this struggle around land has shaped up is based on a much deeper history of caste, inequality, caste relations, and also place-based identity, which both these communities draw on in kind of, in this contestation that we have seen. And so, for example, when we would go to the village, I was never interested in the longer history of these areas. I don't know much about the history of the city or these villages. And I would go and ask people, well, what are the changes that have been happening here? We were interested in like last 10 years, what's been happening. But our interlocutors would actually start in some faraway period. They would start somewhere back in the 16th century, 17th century. They would start talking about how their ancestors came to this place, how they were granted land by the king, and things like that. And in the beginning, I was like, well, can we like get up to the present? I mean, this is like not interesting to me. But then I began to realize that these historical narratives that we were being told both by Dalits and by Reddis of these villages really represent their sense of belonging, their sense of connection with the place, as well as with their caste communities, which, as you know, in the villages have always been very closely interlinked. And so, the telling of these caste kind of histories was about laying claim to that place, laying claim to the land. And particularly interesting were the histories being told by the Dalits, who were basically, talking about how they used to have a very honored place in the village. This particular subcaste that we were interacting with were, kind of the village servants that had been appointed by the king. This is in the case they were talking about one of the warrior kings, to look after the village and to collect the taxes and to pass messages back and forth. And so they told us these really fantastic tales about the roles that their grandfathers used to play in the village, and basically trying to say that we used to have a very honored place in this society, but now we have been basically displaced and marginalized because of these machinations of the dominant community. Sorry, I haven't been keeping up with the slide. This is a house of a rich Reddy landlord. I'm just trying to show you the inequalities into the village, which you'd all be familiar with. This is the office of one of the Dalit broker activists that I was talking about. And this is a quote from one of our informants talking about why they take the help of Dalit organizations in their struggles around land. And of course, talking about Ambedkar and the need for organization, for collectivity. And okay, going back to the stories, the caste history. So one day we were in the house of one of our Dalit interlocutors, and he brought out this really beautiful instrument, which he said had belonged to his grandfather. And this was something which was presented to the particular family of the village who was responsible to the king, and was used for collecting taxes. That bowl, which you see there, that spoon, is called Chalavadi Ganti Battalu. Chalavadi is the name of the subcaste. Was used to go around and collect grain from all the farmers. And so he told us this really fantastic story about the role which his family used to play in the village and why they were so important. So to me, that was a really significant moment, because it really showed me how, even though these villages on the surface are becoming very rapidly urbanized, agriculture has stopped, people have been selling off their land, and yet the village remains in very important ways. The village as identity, as place, as the source of social identity for all the different communities that live there. It remains as as a social entity, despite the fact that all around it, what you only see is this kind of urbanization. So I guess the kind of questions that I would like to leave with would be that, then what do these kinds of examples tell us about the transition from rural to urban? If we think about the city as really an agglomeration of villages that have been incorporated into the urban over periods of time, then what does this come together to create a city? Does it become something else then? or in what ways are these earlier social formations still existing or getting transformed in this process? And more broadly, when viewed from the periphery, then what is a city? So I guess I'll just leave it there with these kinds of questions and hope that we can have some nice discussion around this. Thank you. Sorry, can I just show my last slide? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I have to show my credit slide.
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry. This is just, it's a very large research team, so I just wanted to acknowledge everyone's contributions to this project. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Carol, for that very interesting talk. And I love how both of you have actually hit upon similar things in your talk, although of course separated by a couple of thousand years. So I'll start with a couple of questions that have come for Smriti. Somebody who does not want to be named says, is it more prestigious for archaeologists to work on urban sites? So does this explain why there is a greater focus among archaeologists, or rather, is there generally a larger focus among archaeologists and maybe also historians on the urban rather than on, say, the nature of networks or relationships between different settlements? So yeah, to start with, is it more prestigious for archaeologists to work on urban sites?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's true. I think it is seen as more prestigious. But I would even take that forward and say it's not just about the urban, but I'd say it's seen as more prestigious even if you were excavating rather than surveying. And I think that we had this conversation earlier in one of the talks, is how surveying is seen as not as exciting as excavating, and it's seen as more like and so I think there are hierarchies of prestige, if that's the word that I can use, amongst like different things you can like work on. I would also say the prestige, there's also a prestige to older as opposed to recent. Like it's seen as better to be working on a much earlier site. Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Okay, and sort of maybe not really linked, but Jaya wants to know. Don't you think in Keezhadi the goal of looking for the urban itself is problematic as it tries to presuppose the findings?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's really interesting, the contradiction in my mind, because they have stated that it's an industrial site, and I think this is why I think the question of what is urban then, this assumption that if there's industrial activity, it must be urban. There seems to be a leap of faith in between the two notions. Right? Like it doesn't have to necessarily mean the two are equal, and therefore I think I don't even think in their search that it makes sense. But I agree that going to look for the urban in itself is problematic, because and I think that's what the imagination that I was trying to set up was, that if you're always imagining that you're looking for this Harappan like site, then will you never when you look at it, you just may never recognize some other site, because you're always looking for this this imagination that you have. And so there are post holes which are much more subtle, and they are going to be dwellings that look very different. You just may never see it because you're thinking of that. That's my perception anyway.
Okay, so since you mentioned the Harappan, do you find this also a little problematic, trying to link something? Is there actually a link? Let me ask you that. Actually, there was a question on about this in the last few talks by some people asking, actually, is there any Harappan link between, is there any link between the Harappan period and some of the urban sites, or particularly Keezhadi? Some people asked this a few days ago.
No, there's none at all. And I think that's why I find it interesting that the articles keep talking about Harappan because they're also clearly aware that it isn't the same. There is a difference in terms of which media you're looking at. So I think there's a slight shift when you go to Tamil newspapers and stuff, where there's a much more embracing of it being the same, not like. But I think the archaeologists have been careful to say this is like that, and therefore they're only like they're trying to say that it looks like it rather than say it is equal to that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't think there's any connection.
Okay. Okay. Just a minute. Okay, so I have a few questions for. Okay, some more. A follow-up from Jaya. Does the job of the archaeologist end with excavating the artifacts, or does he or she also build the history from them? This is for you, Smriti.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering, like, yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say also with the faces and the kind of, those are the, I think, the gaps that, are missing in my mind. Like, I don't think, I do think that that's missing. And I feel like a lot of the previous, and I don't think I mentioned this, but the construction of the urban in the South Asian context, I think comes from very much from historians, ancient historians, and how they created the idea of it. And I think it should be archaeologists also having this conversation and talking about what it means for them and how it relates to material remains that they are finding or the brick structures they are not finding. And like, how do we understand it then? And yeah, I think that there is much more analysis and interpretation required.
Okay. Anna George wants to know, and this is for both of you. Carol, can you turn on your mic as well? So does the popular notion that urban spaces are more civilized cause a bias in academia? I think you touched upon this a little bit, Smriti, in your talk, but maybe you can go first, and then Carol, you can also follow up on that.
Yeah, I do think that, I mean, I feel like nobody says it anymore. I think these binaries of civilized and primitive are not mentioned anymore in most cases. But I do think that there's this, it all seems to lead to that in some ways, this idea that if it's an urban, if it is like the larger the city, the more civilized it is, and village is not so, or it is somehow not as, progressive, or, those are terms I suppose you would think in terms of the current context. And I think they are pushed into how we think of the past as well in some ways.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Carol?
Yeah, I would agree. Nobody would probably talk about a space as more or less civilized, or a society. In these days, it wouldn't be politically correct or academically correct. But it's also true that if you look at kind of contemporary social or economic policy, it's all biased towards the urban. There is a very entrenched notion which comes from international policymakers. It comes right down to the central government and beyond, that urbanization is the only way you make progress. And as I said, urbanization is equated with economic development, industrialization, etc. And yet we have this huge crisis of cities, right? We have a huge crisis of the urban across, the global South. And there's hardly any lateral thinking that, how do we actually, now there's thinking because of the COVID reverse migration issue, that how do we actually revitalize the agrarian in the world? Because we cannot, it would be hard to envision 90% of India's population living in cities, given the nature of the post-industrial, economy. So, I think that bias is there. That bias is that the city is modern, the city is progressive, and the city is where you can make money, where you can actually see some economic mobility. And these are very entrenched notions that are hard to kind of shake in academics and in policy.
Okay. Carol, there's a question for you from Ranjita Datta, who says, does, in your case study, the urban studies in your case study, does it take into consideration religious identities and religion?
We didn't really look directly at that because it wasn't that significant in the areas, although there is a small Muslim community in these villages. But I should say that we also didn't go out to study caste. We went to study, real estate development, land, and changing agrarian economies. And caste came at us, and we could not neglect it. After a while, it became so important, so central to understanding what was happening, that that's one of the things we ended up focusing on.
Okay. So a follow-up to what you just said, Pradita Nambiar wants to know, Carol, is caste conflict also seen more as a rural phenomenon than urban?
No, I mean, that's exactly, I think what I'm trying to say is that we tend to think of caste as belonging to the village, right? And somehow disappearing in the city.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, this is just one example to show how it's not true, that this is a peri-urban, urbanizing site, and how caste is actually becoming more solidified and more important in terms of understanding the social struggles that are happening. If you look at Bangalore city, if you look at the question of slums, you know, informal settlements and the struggle for land, the struggle against evictions, they have all been led by Dalit organizations, right? It's just that, you know, as kind of middle class urbanites, we often don't think about caste. It's not like part of our normal life world within the urban middle class. But for all the other, you know, classes of urban society, it's absolutely central. But the point is that caste also changes its character in the urban, and that's something which we need to do a lot more work on. There's not actually a lot of good scholarship that actually asks that question. That, you know, there are Reddys in the villages, there are Reddys in the city. How are they different? Are they different? Are they the same? You know, these are questions which I would like to pursue, actually.
Interesting. Susan Bean wants to know, what's the dynamic between urban planning and locally engineered developments like the aggregate lands that were discussed?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, and it's very complicated. There is, of course, the comprehensive development plan, and every 10 years it's revised. Every 10 years there's a huge debate about it. The current draft plan is still in limbo because, you know, it's put out for public comment and it comes back, and, you know, there's a huge debate around it. People who've worked on urban planning in Bangalore basically point out that the plan is followed more in its breach than anything else. And that goes for bylaws, construction, building bylaws, everything else as well, that the plan actually provides a framework around which everything else happens, but not through it. So the plan does not impose order on urban space. It does not actually determine how the city grows in any kind of straightforward way. It provides a kind of a framework around which people have to operate. So like, as I try to point out, that in the green belt, there are certain kinds of land transformation happening, which is outside the law or, you know, fuzzy in terms of the law. But if you're inside the BBMP limits, then there are other ways in which you can pursue your real estate business. But again, there are all these other illegalities that have to happen. So it's a really complicated problem. Planning is one of the biggest issues for the city, because the plans just have not worked anywhere.
So this is what you alluded to in your talk when you said it's not that a lack of planning has led to what we see in Bangalore. That's what you meant.
I mean, often we think that if only we had better planning, we wouldn't have the chaos we have in the city, but that's just not true. We have plenty of planning. The planning is not working. And I think a lot of people are talking about rethinking the notion of planning instead of having master plan top down. You know, you sit with a satellite image and try to fix it. You have to work from bottom. You have to start from the ground reality. And the ground reality is extremely messy, either in terms of, you know, land tenure, land rights, you know, different claims to land and the communities who are living there is extremely messy. And urban planners are not really trained to look at that mess and figure out, you know, how to work from that point of view.
Okay. Carol, there's one more question for you. Yeah. In what ways, you spoke a lot about the formation of layouts. In what ways are the formation of layouts now different from the establishment of layouts, say, 100 years ago? So when some of the older neighborhoods like Malleshwaram or Basavangudi were formed,
so
is the process different?
Well, that was the question. I'm wondering whether, if I'm looking at what's happening with layouts today, can I learn more about what happened then? And I'm not sure, because I haven't looked at layouts which were already inside the city. My understanding from like Janaki Nair's work is that actually this revenue layout thing only started in the 80s. And no one has really traced that history in detail. Places like Malleshwaram were planned layouts. So that's the thing about Bangalore. It's a mishmash, right? There are large institutional areas where land was acquired for these public sector industries and, you know, BHEL and all these and all these places. Then there are the planned layouts like Malleshwaram, which were planned by the city, right? So that's where planning in some sense worked, right? It's a kind of a better neighborhood in terms of livability. And then there's the revenue layouts where it's just being done through this kind of informal process that I talked about. And then there's informal settlements, which is basically land being squatted upon, right? So all of these things exist together. And I think, you know, we can probably look at what's happening today to understand how it came about earlier. But without really going to those neighborhoods and doing oral histories and, looking for documents, it's hard to make that equation. To me, the most important difference now since the 90s in Bangalore is this huge rise in land values. Because the city has exploded so much, because there's a certain kind of very high-end development that's happened with the coming of the IT industry and an influx of certain kinds of people. I think that is the big difference than what you would have maybe seen in the 80s in terms of revenue layouts.
Okay. I'm going to put a question to you, Carol, which is from Uma Tanuku. She specifically mentioned it's for you, but I think it's a nice one. We'll start with you, and then I thought maybe Smriti, you and Carol can speak for a few minutes, maybe just tying up what you both think about on urbanization, whatever. You can take it whichever way you want. But Uma Tanuku wants to ask you, Carol, will archaeologists be interested in excavating sites like cities like Bangalore in, say, 500 years down the line?
Definitely. I think, in fact, Smriti and I have talked about excavating it now. I mean, there's nothing wrong with contemporary archaeology because our memories are very short, right? And we don't really know what lies beneath the house where we live today. Susan Bean is in the audience. She was my teacher, actually, and she has written about, and she worked in a village outside Bangalore back in the 70s for her field work, which is now like just in part of the city. So, that biography of a particular village and what happened to it could very much be enriched with archaeology because, people just don't keep artifacts or records or, house plans. It's really hard to do urban history in India, actually, in terms of finding documentation.
You want to add to that, Smriti?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if I'm going to go in a different direction, but I was thinking in terms of what we both spoke about and connecting the two. And I was thinking, to me, it's interesting that, Carol, when she's working on Bangalore, doesn't have to question whether it was a state or whether it was a city. Whereas we have to actually question, was it really a city? Was it really urban? Was it a state? And what that does in terms of the discipline, like what does it do in terms of how we understand if we're constantly questioning the beginning of it. But I also think it's interesting, again, not to connect it as like a direct connection between the past and the present, but also how like the city, even in Bangalore, has so many different spaces where different activities happen. And whether we're just not imagining that for the past when we think of it, in looking for these brick structures and only looking for that. Because I think the empty spaces of the communal activities that happen or where the more ephemeral activities happen are also really important in understanding the rest of the relationship in what happens in this space. I mean, those were the two I really thought of when I was listening to both of them.
Okay.
I don't know what Carol thought of this.
I'll pass.
Okay. In that case, Smriti, I'll put one last question to you, and then I think we need to wind up. So this is from Hemant, who asks you, you mentioned that the notion of urbanism in pre-modern India mostly comes from historian scholarship, and archaeologists need to think about this a bit more. And you also talked about Vishnu Priya's urbanism and Gordon Child's understanding of it, blah, blah, blah. How do you think we should shift archaeological understandings of urbanism in South Asia?
I think this is connected. I mean, I have to say that it's a bit of a generalization. I wouldn't say only historians and not archaeologists. I mean, that would be, and also this whole idea of who is an archaeologist, who is not. I mean, I won't go into that. But I do think I think there's a lack of imagination in how we're thinking of it, in how we're thinking of the excavation as well. Like, I do think it's interesting that there's the place we decide to excavate or where in that site we decide to excavate never seems to be something we discuss. It never seems to be something we talk about. Like, why did we choose to go to this particular place, or in this particular place, why did we choose to excavate here? I mean, I feel like, are we always led by, and this is connected to what Carol said, that even if, say, I was going to excavate it in Bangalore, is it always going to be where is the space and where can I excavate? And am I never going to have the option of deciding where? And is that true even in a place not like Bangalore, like say in Keezhadi? Is it because there's a coconut tree somewhere that you cannot excavate? Is that what is leading it? And I think there needs to be more of a discussion in these things as well, because then it makes it clearer what your choices were and what you decided to do. And then it makes it clearer in terms of understanding then what you actually exploited. I don't know if that's a very roundabout way of saying what, answering your question.
No, that was good. That was good. I would, Carol, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I guess there are many questions about, I mean, I would not agree that we necessarily know what is a city. I think that's what I was trying to say, is that, you know, we have a concept of the city which isn't really fitting a lot of what we see happening. And so then how do we actually get out of these categories, whether it's urban, rural, or anything else, right? How do we, and that's a matter also, I think, again, is looking at the ground up, that seeing what is there on the ground reality and how do we build concepts out of that. Whether it's specific to South Asia or a much smaller region or larger region is another question, right? That is there something specific about South Asian cities that we could identify, or, you know, would we lump them with other regions also? I don't know what the debates are in terms of archaeology, but I don't think that debate has really happened in urban studies either. It's only beginning to happen.
Okay. Okay. I think we will have to wind up the discussion now. Thank you both, Smriti and Carol, for making this a really fascinating look at urbanization from two very different ends of not just a temporal spectrum, but also other ways. So I would just like to announce that tomorrow's talk, which is the last in the series, is by Hemant Kadambi, who's from the Shiv Nadar University. And Hemant will be speaking a little bit more about archaeology and the construction of the past. I will leave it at that right now. So I hope to see all of you tomorrow as well. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.